Well, good morning and welcome to the Morning Report. My name is Willie Lawson. Trust that you are well today. You know, it is not a lot of fun to be right all the time, but it's an awful lot of fun to be right all the time. When a lot of people in the country were calling for the legalization of marijuana, and even my own personal conversation with people, I always I don't think it's such a good idea. Uh, I just don't think it's a good idea. And I kept getting, well, it's not as addictive. It's not. I mean, it's not as addictive as alcohol. It's not as bad as this. It's not. So whenever you have an argument and your argument goes, well, it's not as bad as this or this, it doesn't mean it's not bad. It doesn't mean it's not bad. But now the New York Times, who did a six-part series advocating for the legalization of marijuana, has decided that America has a marijuana problem. So, in a cultural movement few would have predicted a decade ago, except me, the editorial board of the New York Times has publicly acknowledged that America has a marijuana problem. And that admission matters. Because for years, the dominant narrative surrounding cannabis legalization was one of inevitability and harmlessness. I told you about, if you've been with me for a long time, this air of an inevitability. Oh, it's going to happen. So why are you fighting it? It's going to happen anyway, right? And that marijuana was harmless. It's just a plant. It's harmless. Well, cocaine comes from a plant too, and crack is not harmless. Neither is meth. Anyway, so critics were portrayed as relics of a failed war on drugs, right? Advocates compared federal marijuana prohibition to alcohol prohibition, and they assured Americans that legalization would produce a minimal downside. Addiction was described as rare. Mental health concerns were dismissed. Use rates, were told, would not dramatically rise. Now, even one of the legislation's most influential institutional supporters, New York Times, is conceding that those predictions did not hold up. And the shift is not small. It's not subtle. It is an admission that the cultural messaging around marijuana was incomplete at the best and misleading at worst. There has been an explosion of daily use. The most glaring data point cited in the editorial in their editorial that they wrote is the surge of daily marijuana use. Roughly 18 million Americans now use marijuana almost daily, defined as 5 or more times a week. The numbers were approximately 6 million just 4 years ago in 2012. I mean, not 4 years ago, back in 2012. In 1992, it was under a million. This is not incremental growth. That is a behavioral transformation. More Americans use marijuana daily than consume alcohol daily. That fact alone should reframe the whole debate. Because alcohol has long been considered America's most widely used intoxicant. Yet weed, once illegal in every state, has now overtaken it in daily consumption frequency. Legalization advocates often argued that marijuana was already widely used and the legal markets would simply regulate the existing reality. What the data shows instead, data shows instead that the legalization dramatically normalized use, increased accessibility, commercial marketing, and higher potency products expanded demand. I was driving somewhere yesterday down a road that I hadn't been on in a while, and I noticed, holy crap, there's a whole bunch of weed stores, and I'm not talking about the old-fashioned head shops of the '80s, right? Where you go into the head shop and there was a bunch of pipes and stuff behind the counter. some bongs behind the counter, and the sign said for tobacco use only. Wink, wink, nudge, nudge, and a whole bunch of like tie-dye T-shirts and posters and stuff. You remember the head shop, right? No, I'm talking about these clinical-looking places, these very clinical-looking places that are like medical places, right? They're all weed shops. You go in there and there's a counter and there's a show. I mean, there's a showcase and all different kinds of weeds of all different potencies. And in order to get to the front when you're doing that kind of thing, potency is a problem. I mean, is a challenge. It's got to work. It's got to work a lot. So potency has been increased. This is not your grandma's weed. This is not your grandma's sit, smoke a joint, chill out kind of weed. This is not. And because markets do what markets do. When a product is legalized, branded, advertised, and taxed, consumption increases. Now, this is not a moral judgment necessarily. It's an economic reality. Now, we were told, we were continually told this, that the health consequences were going to be minor. Willie personally thought that inhaling hot gases into your lungs cannot be a good idea, whether it's tobacco smoke or whether it's marijuana smoke or whether it's the herb cigarette smokes, whatever. If it's lit and it's hot and it's in your lungs, that's hotter than your body temperature, it can't be a good thing, right? Smoke in your body. I don't care where the smoke came. I don't care where the smoke comes from. It's generally not a good thing. People who die in fires normally die of smoke inhalation. They don't normally die because they were charred to death in a fire. That's not what normally happens. They die because of smoke inhalation. And if you find their charred remains, they were dead before they got burned alive. Mostly. So in 2014, when legalization was gaining momentum, many commentators describe marijuana addiction and dependence as relatively minor problems, unless it's happening to you, compared to heroin. Again, like I said before, but it's not as bad as heroin or meth. Weed was framed as benign, but addiction is not only measured solely against the extreme substances, it's measured by impact on individuals' functioning, mental health, and societal costs. Now, there are a whole bunch of things that people are addicted to that certain people can do and be fine with. Food is one. Sex is another. All sorts of things that people are mentally and psychologically addicted to. The editorial has now acknowledged rising cases of cannabis hyperemesis syndrome, a condition that's characterized by severe vomiting and abdominal pain caused with heavy cannabis use. Approximately 2.8 million Americans reportedly experience this condition annually. Emergency room visits for marijuana-linked paranoia. Golly, even in the 70s, man, 70s and 80s, people who smoked pot. Now, I did not smoke pot. Why? Because I was a musician and I thought hot gases in my lungs were a bad idea. All right. But, I said, you felt paranoid. So emergency room visits for marijuana-linked paranoia and psychosis have increased. Clinicians have documented stronger associations between high THC products and psychiatric complications. Chronic use among adolescents is linked to numerous studies to increased risk of anxiety disorders. Do we talk about anxiety all the time? So much, in fact, that people say, hey, smoke a joint, you won't be anxious. And if you smoke a joint that has a lot of THC or high THC content, yeah, you may be anxious. You may be more anxious than before. Smoke a joint, you won't be depressed. Well, it could be that if you smoke a joint, you'll be more depressed than you were before. Hey, man, smoke a joint, get your brain together. it could be that if you smoke a joint, that that you may be more cognitively impaired than you were before because of the high THC content. So to be clear, marijuana is not heroin, okay, and it does not produce the same overdose mortality rates as opioids. But the absence of overdose deaths does not equal harmlessness. It's not the same as what is harmless. Sugar doesn't, as far as we know, have the same overdose mortality rates as opioids. So if you decide to eat, 4 Snickers bars, you're probably not going to die. You're not going to overeat. You're probably not going to die because of it. You could probably eat 10. You may be sick, but you won't die. But if you do too much meth, you could overdose on meth. You could overdose on heroin. Hard to overdose on Snickers in one setting. Now, if you eat 10 a day for 100 days, yeah, you're gonna be massive sick, and you could put yourself into a sugar coma and die. But it ain't the same. And comparing them, and some of you are comparing that, and they're nowhere near the same. So stop it. So policy debates often fall into false binaries, this or this, right? Either a substance is catastrophic and it should be banned entirely, or it's perfectly safe and it should be celebrated. Reality is more complicated. Have you noticed? Substances can be legal and still produce measurable public health consequences. Alcohol. Now, I personally, no, I want to have full disclosure here. I haven't had any alcohol for, golly, almost 35 years. I stopped drinking a long time ago. And it wasn't a problem. I really felt like I had my share. I was done. I'm all full up. I'm done. So you said you have a glass of wine occasionally? No. Have a beer, at a July 4th, party? No, I don't. I don't. I don't drink alcohol anymore. Used to in the 80s, early part of the 80s, but I pretty much stopped drinking shortly after my son was born. He's 35 now, so it's been about 35 years. So there are, legal substances that produce measurable public health consequences. One of the things that we talked about here was driving under the influence. Another area that has quietly grown in significance is impaired driving. Alcohol impairment has decades of standardized measurement tools. Blood alcohol content thresholds, right? We've had that. Breathalyzers, legal benchmarks. Cannabis impairment is a little bit more complex because THC can remain in the bloodstream long after intoxication subsides. As long after the high is gone, THC can stay in the bloodstream. Detecting real-time impairment presents enforcement challenges. But the problem remains: increased daily use of correlated with increased instances of impaired driving. The more people do it, the more we catch them driving high. Public safety officials across legalized states have reported rising concerns. Surprise, surprise, surprise. Normalization changes behavior. If marijuana is culturally framed as harmless, users may underestimate impairment. Because what we do here in this country, if government says something is harmless, then we think it should be what I call milk safe. You have as much as you want. It's fine. It's legal. Fine. It's like water. Do as much as you want. But you remember a minute ago I was talking about all these places, Trulieve and just a bunch of these weed places They lobbied for this. And here in Florida, we commonly call them the corporate incentives, and we call them big weed, like big oil, big pharma, big weed, because there was so much money to be made. So perhaps the most interesting aspect of this whole editorial is its critique of corporate marijuana interests, because everyone saw it. Well, a lot of people had this interest that people would get their, they get their weed from the same place they always get their weed, right? From Junebug, or around the corner, who sold weed out of his house. And Junebug would have a legitimate quote unquote business. Junebug wouldn't be going to jail. Junebug would get his weed, and you would go by and get no. People never thought that there'd be brick and mortar storefronts in your neighborhood selling weed, and they pop up like liquor stores did in the hood, and they pop up like liquor stores did in the hood. Because legalization didn't produce a cottage industry of small scale growers, it produced large, vertically integrated cannabis corporations. These companies invest heavily in branding, marketing, and lobbying. Their financial incentives are clear: increase consumption, expand product lines, and reduce regulatory barriers. The federal reclassification of marijuana from Schedule 1 to Schedule 3 has major implications. Under federal law, Schedule 1 substances prevent companies from deducting ordinary business expenses. Schedule 3 reclassification changes that calculation, potentially increasing profitability significantly. The editorial questions whether the reclassification aligns with a policy of grudging toleration. If marijuana is tolerated but risky, why enhance corporate profitability without tightening guardrails? This is where the cultural conversation becomes really uncomfortable. But we always talk about the uncomfortable here. Many who oppose big tobacco or big pharma find themselves defending big weed. Yet the incentive structure is the same: maximize consumption of a psychoactive product. It's the same. So cultural shifts like this don't happen in isolation. They happen through repetition. Marijuana moved from from taboo to trendy, from illegal to therapeutic, from underground to mainstream. Media depictions changed. Public service campaigns faded. No more. What was that movie? Oh, I'll think of it. Reefer Madness. No more Reefer Madness, right? Discussions about potency were overshadowed by discussions about social justice reform. Because, the people who were getting busted for these minor marijuana crimes were, of course, black people and Latinos. And, if you were against weed, you're racist, right? I know that seems like a huge jump, but it really isn't. Legalization was often framed as primarily legalization was often framed primarily as a criminal justice issue. Reducing incarceration disparities ended nonviolent drug prosecutions. So these concerns were real and legitimate, some of them, but policy rarely produces only one outcome. Criminal justice reform and increased use can occur simultaneously. We always act like we can't do things at the same time. The public was told legalization would not meaningfully increase consumption. We were told the people who are smoking pot now are the same people who will continue smoking pot, and that the people who are not smoking pot wouldn't smoke pot. That prediction now appears to be incorrect. Now, another unexamined issue is potency escalation. Now, if you are in competition with the weed joint down the street, The drug dealer thing is still it's still in play. The heroin dealer doesn't mind so much if one of their customers ODs. That lets the other heroin users know that that dealer has got some good, you know what? That's what that lets them know. And that mentality is the same, right? It's exactly the same. So these companies are producing product with higher and higher potency levels. So the marijuana of the 1970s and 80s averaged significantly lower THC concentration than the modern products. Because today's legal markets offer high potency flowers, concentrates, edibles, vape cartridges, and synthetic derivatives. Higher potency increases intoxication intensity. It also increases the risk of dependency and psychiatric side effects in vulnerable populations. Legalization did not merely maintain the old product under a new regulation. And this is the thought pattern of a lot of people. Legalization was going to just maintain the old product. It was going to still be the weed that you smoked in college if you went to college in the 70s or the 80s. No, what it did was it facilitated innovation. And innovation in psychoactive substances often means stronger effects. And none of this automatically implies that marijuana should be recriminalized. We should talk about this though. That is not the argument being made by the editorial board, nor is it necessarily the most practical solution. Criminalization carries its own societal costs. Enforcement disparities, incarceration burdens, and the black market violence against legitimate concerns under prohibition framework. Yeah. The question is not legalization versus prohibition. The question is regulation versus sort of a laissez-faire commercialization. If marijuana is legal, should there be a THC potency cap? Should there be stricter labeling requirements, advertising restrictions similar to tobacco? Enhanced DUI enforcement, greater funding for addiction treatment. That's what the article talks about. Me, when I get arguments like, well, alcohol's legal, maybe it shouldn't be. Now, I understand what happened in Prohibition. I mean, Prohibition basically gave the mob a foothold and flowers to grow. I know. Maybe it shouldn't be. Maybe it shouldn't be legal. And maybe there definitely should be THC potency caps. How you enforce that, I don't know. I don't think this whole stricter labeling requirements thing always makes me laugh because really, when's the last time you grabbed a beer and said, "Oh, don't drink this if you're pregnant"? Well, I'm a dude. I'm not going to get pregnant. Yeah, Little Kings. 6% beer. Yeah, I'm going to go ahead and drink this. I'm going to drink recent damn labels. Advertising is important. And, you don't see the Marlboro Man anymore. Maybe you shouldn't see Snoop and being the weed man. And enhance the UI enforcement, most definitely. Because a family of 5 that gets murdered with a driver who's either, it doesn't matter if they, been drinking scotch or if they've been smoking weed. If the family of 5 that gets murdered on the roads, it doesn't matter what the intoxicant is. It just doesn't matter. Now, The articles suggest that maybe there should be greater funding in addiction treatment. Maybe there should be less addiction. Let's approach it from the supply side. Maybe there should be less addiction because greater funding for addiction treatment causes a whole bunch of other problems, right? It doesn't address the major cause. Now, we can talk about this. These are policy debates that are worth having. Because the deeper issue revealed by this editorial is cultural overconfidence. Way too often, major policy shifts are accompanied by the sweeping claims, this will solve the problem. With no downside. Concerns are exaggerated. Take the COVID shot. It'll solve the problem. Although, all these people on MS Now and MSNBC back in the day and CNN and all these folks that, came on the TV and told you that this will solve the problem. This will end it. If you take the vaccine, it won't go any further. They said this. And the people who didn't take the vaccine were the problem. The people who weren't sick and didn't take the vaccine were somehow the problem. If I don't have the thing, I can't give it to you, whether I take the vaccine or not. Remember these discussions? This incredible overconfidence, and there's no downside. Anybody who has any concerns are, wearing tinfoil hats, and their concerns are exaggerated. Reality is rarely that cooperative. Marijuana legalization may have reduced certain criminal justice harms while simultaneously increasing public health challenges. Those two facts can coexist. Two things can be true at the same time. Going forward, if America does indeed have a marijuana problem, as now acknowledged by the one legalization's early champions, the next step must be an honest assessment, which we rarely have. Now, that would include daily use has tripled in more than a decade, when we were told that daily use wouldn't go up. Tripled. Millions of people now experience adverse health consequences, when we were told that that would not be the case. Corporate incentives push toward higher consumption because the more people who use, the more money they make. It's not going to be, mom and pop growing a little weed in their backyard to sell to their neighbors. That is not what happened. Potency has dramatically increased because now you have to get a bigger punch to sell because there are more people in the market. And cultural messaging underestimates risk always. Because cultural messaging said, hey man, it's cool, it's fine, smoke a little weed, you'll be all right. Just like you say, have a drink, you'll be all right. Takes the edge off. Public policy must adapt to evidence. Evidence. And that's not a sign of weakness. It's a sign of maturity. The United States has navigated similar challenges before. Tobacco use once carried social prestige. Everybody had a cigarette, I listened to, I know I've gone down a bunch of rabbit trails today. I listened to Sirius XM channel 148. It has a lot of old radio shows. And you listen to these shows, and people are offering everybody smoked apparently, because every time someone got offered a cigarette, they said, sure. Cigarette? Sure. Because it was social prestige. There were actually public health campaigns advertising restrictions and regulation gradually reduced smoking rates without returning to an outright prohibition. Because back in the 19-teens and 1920s, there were advertisements that said doctors, said smoking was good for you. but we figured out that it wasn't. Yes, and there's those breakthrough cases where, my grandpa smoked a pack of Marlboros every day until he was 100. All right. And there are also cases where somebody smoked, a pack of Marlboros every day and died at 37 to horrific lung cancer. So maybe hot gases in your lungs isn't a good idea. Now, alcohol, firewater, remains legal but regulated through age restrictions, licensing laws, DUI enforcement, and advertising controls. Now, marijuana policy likely will require a similar recalibration. Neither moral panic or blind enthusiasm. The most significant part of the story is not the data, it's the admission. So when a national newspaper publicly acknowledges that earlier assumptions about marijuana legalization were overly optimistic, they were wrong. It signals that the cultural debate is starting. It's starting to evolve. The era of simplistic, harmless weed rhetoric is ending. In its place comes a more complicated conversation about risk, responsibility, corporate power, and public health. America may not need to reverse legalization entirely, but it may need to confront the unintended consequences of normalization, daily intoxication at scale. Now I'm going to have to do, and you should do the research too. If someone says to the doctor or to the reporter, I drink alcohol every day. I have 2 or 3 alcoholic beverages every day. We start thinking of that as an addiction, don't we? Don't we? Am I wrong here? Write in the comments. Every day. So if you smoke weed every day, if you can't get on with your day and whatever is normal without smoking weed, do you have a weed problem? You might just have a weed problem. So acknowledging reality is the first step towards better policy. The next step is ensuring that regulation reflects what we now know, not what we once hoped. The marijuana debate is not over. Hopefully, it's just entering a more honest phase. My name is Willie Lawson. This is the Morning Report. Until we see you again, go out there and learn something, love somebody, and for goodness sake, y'all take care of yourself. We will see you when we see you. Peace.